Order. I'd like to welcome everybody to the first public evidence session of the newly elected Defence Committee. In particular, a very warm welcome to our esteemed, experienced expert witnesses today, Professor Malcolm Chalmers, and I hope we may have Ms. Fenella McGerty joining us online, but we are experiencing some technical glitches. I'd like to ask Professor Chalmers to formally introduce himself to the committee.
Very good. I'm Malcolm Chalmers. I'm the Deputy Director General at the Royal United Services Institute.
Brilliant. Well, look, just to get things off to a nice, easy starter for yourself, Professor Chalmers, do you think that our armed forces can achieve what they are being asked to achieve within the current levels of defence expenditure?
That's a how long is a piece of string sort of question.
It's a nice, easy one.
Clearly, if the armed forces had more resources, then they could achieve more. The nature of military preparation is you're preparing for the possibility of conflict with other countries and indeed with other adversaries. And your chances of success in that are always uncertain, no matter how great the resources you apply to preparatory effort. But you're in a better place if you're better financed. I think I slightly rephrase the question, therefore, and ask what the trends are in that regard. And I think the trends are rather worrying because both compared with our allies and compared with our potential adversaries, the trends in the resources we devote to defence are going in a direction which means we are less capable compared with our allies and compared with our adversaries than we were maybe a decade ago.
Kelvin, I know you wanted to comment on this particular point.
I was just going to actually flip, if you're struggling to answer the question, can defence do, can the armed forces achieve what's being asked of them within with the current levels of defence expenditure? I was going to ask, is it clear that defence knows what it should be doing within the current levels of expenditure, and how much of what it is being asked to do isn't clearly defined and perhaps shouldn't be being done, period?
I think the fact that the government ordered a strategic defence review to answer exactly the question you're asking, suggests that the government isn't entirely clear what the priorities are and whether they can define the priorities more clearly to give the armed forces and the Ministry of Defence clear guidance. I think right now the MOD is being asked to do a wider range of tasks than they have the resources to fulfil.
Okay. I'd like to now bring in Lincoln Jott, please. Lincoln?
Thank you, Chair. Professor, we've obviously had the budget recently, and that has resulted in a little bit more money for defence, so an up arrow. Could you give us a sense of what that new money enables us to do? Is it sort of treading water, pot boiling stuff, or are there enhancements to defence capability? And have you been able to make an assessment of what the budget settlement got us to compared to what 2.5% of GDP, which is the government's declared overall intent over an unspecified period of time? Can you give us a sense of what's in that space and what the budget that we have got for defence currently does?
Sure. Well, the budget allocation for next financial year is 59.8 billion on TDEL, and the government budget statement says that that's a 2.3% per annum real terms growth over a period of 2 years, and that growth is slightly above the rate of GDP growth, and therefore it should mean that there's a slight increase in the proportion of GDP devoted to defence, but only a marginal one. So we're around 2.3%, and maybe it goes up 0.01%, 2.3 to 2.31, or something of that order, depending on how the GDP numbers play out. But in answering the question, what do you get for the extra money, you have to first of all think about the context of a defence budget which is significantly out of balance already at your starting point. If you look at the report of the National Audit Office from last December on the equipment plan, then you can see for the next, I think it's 4 years, the money available, projected to be available in the defence budget, is significantly less than the commitments in the forward plan for the equipment programme. And in addition to that, the pay settlements for the armed forces, the result of accepting the Armed Forces Pay Review Body recommendations this last summer, adds another pressure to the defence budget. So the challenge for MOD budget planners is not to add something new to current plans, it's that the current budget allocation for this year and next year won't be enough to fund the commitments as of those which were reported in that NAO budget. Now, clearly, there have been changes since then. Some projects have slipped, some things have been given up, maybe some new things have been taken on. But certainly the press reports this last summer from the MOD suggest that they haven't entirely closed that gap yet. So closing that gap for this year and for next financial year is the first thing they've got to do. If you want to add more things which we're not doing at present, then you have to take something out on the basis of these budget numbers.
And do you think that the MOD, how sophisticated is the MOD's thinking of what getting to 2.5 looks like? Do they have do you think there's a strong sense of what that would mean?
I think, well, first of all, the impact of getting to 2.5% depends on the timing of getting to 2.5%. So the previous government in April, about a month before the election was called, published something called Defending Britain, which had a timetable for getting 2.5%, which was by the end of the decade, I think by 2030, with a straight line trajectory towards that. So it meant that the defence budget would rise by between 3 and 3.5% per annum in real terms on a straight line. The budget said that the timing for getting to 2.5%, it would be announced at a future fiscal event, which could be the spending review in the spring, but it could be at some future fiscal event. It's not clear yet. The spending review will, however, give us, essentially it will give us defence budget allocations to the end of the Parliament for RDEL, for resource spending, but it also indicates that they'll give her a longer projection for capital spending. So we'll see how that plays out in the case of MOD, but it's certainly, I think, possible that we'll get a sense in the spring as to how much progress towards 2.5% is planned for this Parliament.
But clearly the figure is as an input. I'm interested in the thinking that the MOD has in terms of how developed, sophisticated or otherwise is it. Yeah. Because I have heard other things from MOD colleagues saying that they, if you gave me all that money now, I wouldn't know what to do with it, which was deeply disappointing. But do you think that debate has moved on a bit, and that were we to be on that trajectory, that there would be quite a swept up and sophisticated plan for making that expenditure in a coherent way?
I think there's a lot of work being done around the Strategic Defence Review, as you'd expect, which has been given the explicit and public guidance to work on the basis of 2.5% being available. There are clearly many commentators who would suggest that 2.5% is not enough, but that's the current government policy, and I think it's going to remain so a little while. Who knows? If you have a trajectory of 2.5% by the end of the decade, by 2029 or 2030, you still need to make quite a number of hard choices. It would not in itself mean that the funding gap which the NAO identified last year disappears. It wouldn't do that, because you're not getting to 2.5% at once. You're getting to it over a number of years. You could close that NAO gap in the next year or two if you went to 2.5% next year. but we're not going to. We're going to be staying at 2.3% next year. So you're going to have to make some hard choices within a 2.5% trajectory to the end of the decade. You're not going to be able to do everything which is in current plans. And of course, one of the consequences of, particularly of the war in Ukraine, but other developments as well, is that there are new requirements coming on stream all the time. There are things which we are thinking, my goodness, we really need to take advantage of this. And you're essentially going to have to do net increases of zero. In other words, if you want to put something new in the program which isn't currently in the program, you're going to have to take something out. Maybe the last point to make is that the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, of course, consolidated what was already a trend toward in UK defence to focusing more and more on war fighting rather than expeditionary warfare and operations. And our forces during that long period from the mid-90s up to 2010 or maybe a bit further were increasingly optimized for warfare operations against relatively weak opponents a long way away, exemplified by Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya, and indeed the operations in Syria. And for those operations, there's lots of things you didn't need, which you do need if you want a force which is optimized for deterring Russia in Europe. You didn't need a capability for air defense or combating air defense. You didn't need the mass you need if you're fighting a sophisticated opponent, whether that's Russia or perhaps China in future. And that's been brought home a lot. And you didn't need the stocks of munitions right across the services that you do need for a conventional warfighting scenario. So, and in a way, in the 2010 review certainly, but even I think to a large extent in the 2015 review, the government was operating on an implicit 10-year rule that there wouldn't be a conventional, a large-scale conventional war with a near-peer opponent. And therefore you could take risks on your preparedness and your readiness and instead invest in the platforms. So right across our military services, our armed services, we have a whole range of capabilities which on the face of it look cutting edge. Not always, but in most cases pretty cutting edge, and we continue to invest a lot in new equipment. But if you look behind the curtain and see how long those forces could operate, whether you have the logistics and the munitions and the spare parts and everything else, then it's more worrying. And of course that doesn't mean in all those areas Russia has got wonderfully ready forces, and in some areas Russia has been severely depleted as a result of the war. But nevertheless, that sense of hollowness in our forces is something that's now relevant, and it wasn't in 2010 when we weren't, and we probably didn't need to plan for an imminent conflict with Russia.
Thank you very much. Professor Chalmers, you mentioned about Ukraine. We'll be delving into that very briefly, but you also alluded to a lack of clarity. Now, the new government did mention in its manifesto a commitment to 2.5%. Do you think that the lack of a timetable or the lack of an announcement, obviously there have been lots and lots of announcements in various spheres of government business, but do you think that the lack of a timetable, is that having a major effect? What sort of impact is that having on industry or the wider defence community?
I think it's very important because we don't at the moment have anything from the government on what the defence budget will be beyond next financial year. And whether it's industry or the armed forces, military planners, allies, it's hard to know what the UK will be capable of doing without that budget envelope. Of course, even if you have a clear budget envelope for the next 5 or 10 years, there's still a question about what your priorities are within that. And you can have a discussion, continue to make decisions on relative priorities, but the lack of that budget envelope does create more uncertainty. It's, after all, the government also has a commitment to reach 0.7% of national income on official development assistance, and there's no timetable for that either. It's not clear which of those two goals has a priority right now.
Agreed. I think Calvin Bailey also wanted to come in on this particular point.
Yeah, sorry, I was just going to take you back a bit, because you allude to so the first two questions talking about the amount of money. Like, have we got enough to do what we think we should be doing, and then talking about where the 2.5% goes. But in your answer, you allude to the fact that the 2010 and 2015 defence reviews did significant damage to our ability to warfight. There is this committee in its previous guise produced a readiness paper that kind of touches at where we think we are, but I don't think it's readily or widely understood just the extent of the poor state of our defence at the moment. You know, reaching a nadir in defence spending in 2016 at 44 odd billions. Do you think we're kind of that such is the damage, you know, that we've got a reasonable equipment programme in some places, we've got some good pieces of kit, and I know we're going to come on to this later in another question, so I don't want to go too far. It's just that you went there yourself. Like, how eroded do you actually think we are, and how far behind the line are we before we expect this defence review to start moving us forward?
So I think you implied in your question, it does vary across defence, and there are more problems in some areas than others. And the challenge for the government is not only to identify which are further behind, because in a way a lot depends on what the baseline you're measuring against. Further behind what? That often depends on specific assumptions about what you need. And that the choice as to whether to invest more in, let's say, bring our manoeuvre warfare capability up to speed, compared with our anti-submarine warfare capability, compared with our nuclear deterrent, compared with our deep strike capability in the Royal Air Force. All of those we could invest quite a lot more in right now, in part because there are real concerns about our ability to maintain CASD. There's been a very high priority given to nuclear, and has been for the last 3 years or so, which is reflected in the increased budget allocation. But some of those other areas, less so. They've been given less of a priority in terms of changing allocation. So the question, we will not be able, with any conceivable budget, even if it's a little bit more than 2.5, even if it's 2.6 or 2.7, we will not be able to address that lack of readiness and war stocks and so on across every part of our armed forces in the near future.
Thank you very much, Professor. Alex Baker, you wanted to come in on this particular point?
So yeah, I wanted to just ask about the lack of a roadmap and how much that is felt in our armed forces community on the ground, and you know how much that is contributing to sort of poor morale.
I'm not sure I know the answer to the question about how it contributes to low morale. I think that there's a range of issues. Some of the issues are more about people issues rather than equipment issues, but it's certainly a contributing factor. And as I say, it's not the case that every part of our military is very poorly equipped. I think it does vary quite a lot. But I would say that people issues are as important. And the part of the dilemma, one of the things that's happened in recent years as a result of the 2020 spending review and then the associated integrated review, there was a significant increase in defence spending in real terms, but it was entirely focused on the capital budget, and the resource budget was reduced in real terms, as it turned out, given increased inflation. And that's not only meant cutting back on a whole range of readiness investments in terms of maintenance of equipment, maintenance of infrastructure and what have you. It's also meant that the budget for pay has been significantly restrained. I mean, that started to change in the last two Armed Forces pay review settlements, the last 2 financial years, where the pay increase was more generous. But particularly in those areas where people have alternative employment with special skills, but sometimes not with special skills, people with significant experience in the armed forces are more widely, they've got alternatives. So retention is an issue which is partly one of money, and it's that I think that's a real issue. So the armed forces are unable to get up to their assigned personnel numbers in some cases, and that's worsening in part because of those people issues. So I think it's a people issue as well.
Thank you, Professor. I'd like to now bring in Ian Room, who wanted to delve further into Ukraine.
Hi, Professor. The UK government is obviously committed to support in Ukraine, and what has been the impact on the UK defence of committing £3 billion of military support for Ukraine annually?
Well, we started off at 2.5 billion a year in the first couple of years after the invasion. The government's now got a commitment to devote 3 billion a year, and the National Audit Office actually produced a report just last month which went into some detail about what the main elements of that. I mean, it's the 3 billion is a mixture of different elements. So there is some money being spent on purchasing equipment for transfer to Ukraine. There's some transfer of our own equipment, although the amount of that is declining quite rapidly as we run out of things to transfer. There's quite a lot being spent on training, and there's quite a bit on the direct costs of activities, the MOD, people spending time essentially helping Ukraine in all sorts of ways, many of which are not public. So the question of the opportunity cost, well, that 3 billion compares with a total defence budget of 60 billion. So it's about 5%. In terms of, if we spend 2.3% of our GDP in defence in total, about 0.1% of that 2.3 is on Ukraine. So as a proportion of our total defence effort, it's significant, but it's still pretty small, and it's a lot less as a proportion of our defence effort than you would see in Scandinavian and Baltic countries, who spend a lot more in Ukraine as a proportion of our defence effort. But it's more than some other countries. So that's where we are on that. Of course, the question of what could we do otherwise would depend on whether that total budget remained as it was. And although we're in a bit of a transition period at the moment, in the initial years, that extra money for Ukraine was funded from the Treasury Reserve, so it was on top of the actual allocation. When the government says it's committed to 2.5% of GDP in defence, that includes spending on Ukraine, and therefore, I guess if we get to a moment at some time in the future where we no longer need to spend that money in Ukraine, then there would be a question about whether that money was then available under a 2.5% commitment for other commitments, and I assume it would be.
Are there any other areas within UK defence where we could have done with a £3 billion?
Yeah, of course there are.
Yeah. What would you say there? what sort of areas do you think are critical at the moment?
You know, I think across the armed forces there's a real need for a significant increase in investment in munitions. So that across all our conventional forces, that's a gap. In some areas there are real industrial constraints. If we are buying from the UK in particular, but also to some extent from others, that we can't. Having the money is not enough. You also have to have the industrial capacity. But having said that, I think if you had another 3 billion a year, and you devoted a large part of that to munitions, then you, over the next couple of years, you could make a real difference.
Thank you very much. Professor, we'd now like to interrogate the issue of defence prioritisation. I'd like to bring in Fred Thomas, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Professor Chalmers, for being with us. A question about the Security and Defence Review coming up, due to land early next year. We're not sure exactly when. And a question about what your assessment of the ability for government to really reprioritise and really change things, given that it's been laid out that some of the big ticket items are protected. So defence nuclear, Ukraine we just discussed, AUKUS not being changed. So does that allow room for serious reprioritisation?
Yes, I think it does. I mean, I think it's harder to reprioritise the budget for next year and to some extent the year after, because there are so many contractual commitments in place, and you've got people, and you've got equipment contracts and support contracts, infrastructure contracts and so on. But as the MOD's made it clear in their submission to the NAO a year ago, once you get to year 3 and 4 and 5, then the proportion of the budget which is contractually committed declines quite sharply. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that it's easy to change, because there's a much broader proportion, a much bigger proportion of the budget which is committed in policy terms, and you identify a couple of areas which are only a portion of a defence budget, but nevertheless, there's lots in there which in practice we won't change. But nevertheless, I think once you get 3, 4, 5 years out, there's quite a bit of scope for reprioritisation from one area to another if there's a political decision to do so.
Thank you. And I think not only MOD and serving personnel, but obviously industry will be looking on very keenly to see what comes out of this SDR. How much scope do you think the government will have to change how industry interacts with the customer, being the MOD, in a way that we haven't seen for the last several decades, particularly in terms of how the MOD deals with SMEs as well as primes?
You know, I think a sensible procurement strategy has to make a distinction between some of the larger programs, and you've mentioned AUKUS, which is a very good example, and the nuclear deterrent program, where there's a firm long-term commitment from the government, where the procurement and sustainment of that capability requires long-term certainty, because it requires very large capital investment on by the contractors in massive, multi-billion pound facilities. And therefore what industry needs, and indeed what the military need, is a clear long-term commitment to a particular level of funding and a particular offtake in terms of number of equipment and what have you. We saw in the past in Barrow the problems that were created when we didn't have a clear drumbeat of orders over time, and Barrow to some extent is still struggling with that today. So a significant part of the procurement budget is in that category, where you need a significant degree of certainty to produce most efficiently, and indeed the special financial arrangements for the nuclear budget within the MOD budget with the ring fencing agreements is designed to reflect that, and there's lots of financial flexibility which the rest of the MOD budget does not have. However, there's also a strong argument for a significant part of the procurement budget to be much more flexible and responsive to the very rapid pace of technological development in the defence sector. There is money available for innovation and for new ideas and so on. But sometimes, but I think there is a concern, certainly I would have a concern, if there isn't enough of the procurement budget ring fence for things which we don't know about yet, But we do know that given the pace of technological development, and the Ukrainians themselves are the best example of that, a lot of what the Ukrainians are building now are things which didn't exist before. They started this war fighting with Cold War Soviet equipment, and now they're, by necessity, innovating at an incredible pace, producing things much more cheaply than NATO producers can produce, and very relevant to the battlefield today. And they realise it won't be suitable for the battlefield next year because it will have to keep changing. So we need, in our armed forces, I would admit, make sure we've got sufficient leeway for that. And the SMEs that win from that will be the SMEs which are competitive in producing the best kit for our forces. We're not providing certainty in that area at all. So you need agility as well as certainty, and it's getting that balance. So the challenge is when budgets are tight, and I think they are still tight. The challenge is to ensure that those big programs don't squeeze out the ability to have any agility, because I think...
So very quickly, Professor Chalmers, would you support and would you like to see in the SDR budget ring-fenced for research and development, innovation, particularly for SMEs? Would you like to see our government go that far? Do you think that's a good model?
I think that should be seriously considered, but I think you, as well as ring fencing for the R&D, you also need to have some ring fence for bringing into service the best things that come out of that R&D. I mean, it's a classic British problem, which is well beyond defence, as we seem to be pretty good at research and getting Nobel Prizes and so on, but then the actual manufacture happens elsewhere. In MOD terms, I think we just need to make sure we've got the... And it's hard to put money aside for something which you don't know what it is yet when budgets are tight. But I think my submission would be that would be good value for money.
Thank you very much. Mike Martin, I believe you wanted to come in on this particular point as well.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, Professor Chalmers. So as you know, the Defence Nuclear Organisation used to be funded by the Treasury, and about a decade ago was brought into the MOD budget. And for obvious reasons, it's ring-fenced because it's nuclear. We don't want accidents and all the rest of it, so it must be funded properly. To what degree do you think that financial structure is driving a coach and horses through our conventional capabilities, and would you advocate that the government should look seriously at taking defence nuclear back into the, funded out of the Treasury as a separate enterprise, and keeping the defence conventional budget as something that, to your point, you used the term flexibility earlier, would have more flexibility in it because defence nuclear has been taken out?
There's a number of different dimensions of that, if I may. I mean, there's certainly quite a bit of disagreement between historians of the UK defence effort as to whether nuclear was ever separate. Certainly, the figures which the MOD provides to NATO on our defence spending have always included nuclear, and that's not changed. What has changed recently in the UK is we now have a separate accounting officer for the nuclear budget, and it's ring-fenced in the sense that they have particular ability to, for example, to overcome the annuality problem, to move money from one year to the next, to bring it forward or to push it back within some constraints, but nevertheless a lot more flexibility than for the rest of the defence budget, and I think that all makes sense. But it's still part of defence, and when we talk about the 59.8 budget for next year includes nuclear, what, however, it does mean, based on the experience of recent years, is that if nuclear spends more next year than it's currently planning, then that will increase the 59.8. It will not have to be taken from the rest of the budget. And similarly, if nuclear spends less next year than it's currently planning, that will not be available to the rest of the budget. It will simply be saved, and they'll spend it in a subsequent year. So it's giving, and we're talking about very large sums of money. A small percentage change in nuclear spending next year could be worth hundreds of millions of pounds, and therefore that flexibility is really very welcome indeed. Maybe the other important point to make is that the nuclear enterprise is not hermetically sealed from the rest of the defence enterprise. So if you look at what is included in the defence nuclear enterprise, it includes our SSN attack submarines, which makes sense. It's part of the same industrial enterprise produces them. And the SSNs have a key role to play in protection of our deterrent. But of course, they have lots of other roles as well. It's not only about protecting the nuclear deterrent at all. And then you have other aspects of our defence setup, which again are really important. Anti-submarine warfare in the North Atlantic is critical to the defence of our deterrent. We need P-8 aircraft. We need ASW frigates, Type 23, Type 26, for that role. But those have other roles as well. So do you include them in the cost of nuclear or not? So I think the current arrangement has removed the main problem to which you allude, which is the instability created for the conventional budget by significant variations in the nuclear budget. I think that has been addressed already. I'm not sure you need to go any further without starting to create a separate armed force for nuclear, which wouldn't make any sense at all.
Mike, you wanted to carry on as well on in terms of NATO as well, if you could.
Oh yeah. So the government is talking about NATO first. That's a sort of cornerstone of their approach to defence. Is the UK currently fulfilling its commitments to NATO? And if not, could you illustrate with some examples where we are falling short of our commitments? I mean, these are already agreed, right? We've already agreed to provide certain forces at certain readiness. Are we doing that?
I think the question of NATO first is an interesting one because it's not always clear exactly what is meant by it. Historically, some of the most consequential defence reviews we've had in our country's history have been driven by a NATO first concept. So if you go back, and apologies for the history lesson, but if you go back to the late 1960s and the defence reviews in 1966, 67 and to some extent 68 under Dennis Healey, that was a time when the United States was increasingly focused on a really grinding war in Vietnam, where the Soviet Union had achieved nuclear parity and had 400,000 troops in the centre of Germany. And we were worried about the Soviet threat getting greater. And the government at the time essentially decided to withdraw from east of Suez and focus its efforts on maintaining and indeed improving UK's commitment to NATO. That was a NATO first review. And then after the end of the Cold War, the Soviet threat disappeared for a while, and we increasingly focused on activities elsewhere. And to some extent, our investments as well as our operational spending reflected that. But maybe, the other big review which was in that NATO first category was the Knott Review in 1982, which again was focusing on NATO tasks and disinvesting in what were then called out-of-area operations. Today, I think we're in a situation which is different in many ways, not least because Russia is not the Soviet Union, but nevertheless, NATO first has echoes of 1982 and 1966, I think, today. And it's about focusing on the NATO theatre and NATO operations. And certainly I think there's a very strong argument for doing that. It's not NATO only, but it is prioritising NATO. And in many regards, we already prioritise NATO, but maybe there's more we can do in that regard. Now, that then brings you round to your question, which is about the particular force goals with SACEUR places on countries. If those are for across NATO, certainly across NATO Europe, very ambitious targets indeed. Very few countries meet those targets right now. And SACEUR is not asking countries to meet them right now. He's asking them to meet over a significant period of time. But the UK certainly does not meet all those force targets right now. Probably the area in which we fall furthest behind is in relation to land forces. but it's not only in land forces. So the extent to which, and that is a problem for the UK within NATO compared with other countries which are more land oriented, but others don't meet their targets either. Germany doesn't fully meet its NATO targets. So there's, I think, an ongoing conversation, as I understand it, in NATO about the prioritisation of meeting NATO force goals between now and the long-term aspiration SACEUR has. I think, personally, there's also a question as to whether NATO targets are set in a way which doesn't sufficiently take into account the rapidly changing nature of modern warfare and focuses too much on quantitative targets in terms of a rather traditional concept of warfare, which may be not what we face. But today, final comment, if I may, Chair, I think there is an ongoing conversation to be had, and it relates to your previous question about how far the very considerable expense the UK devotes to its nuclear deterrent is sufficiently taken into account when NATO conducts these burden-sharing exercises between major allies, because at the moment is about 20%, maybe a bit higher, of our defence budget we now devote to nuclear. It's about 0.4, 0.5% of GDP. So if you took that out, then we certainly don't meet our 2% target on the basis of conventional only. But given, they're also, the UK's nuclear deterrent is assigned to NATO. We talk about it in the Nuclear Planning Group. It's an important part of NATO deterrence, so why shouldn't that be counted in NATO burden-sharing exercises?
Thank you very much. Obviously, we had the Prime Minister confirm to the House in an earlier statement about his commitment to NATO, and in fact, to quote his words, that the UK will commit all of our armed forces to NATO, so that NATO first is very much understood in terms of the workings of government. But given the US election this week and the result of that, what impact do you think that, if there is a US pivot to Asia, the Indo-Pacific tilt as is often referred to, what impact do you think that could have on how we operate with respect to NATO and also with respect to Europe?
I think whoever wins the American presidential election today, the trend towards the United States focusing more of its military effort in the Indo-Pacific will continue. It may have, if President Trump, if we have a President Trump in the White House in January, it may accelerate that move. But I think that trend is there, and it's there most of all because of the rise of China. China is now an increasingly capable military power, and the United States is seeking to deter Chinese aggression in China's backyard, and that's a really difficult military task and a much more formidable one for the Pentagon than anything it's faced for many decades. And China is posing that challenge with a defence budget of about 2% of GDP. It's not had to increase the proportion of its national income going to defence because the Chinese economy has been so robust and rapidly growing over a long period of time. Increasingly, those in policy circles in Washington do view most defence issues through a China lens for those very good reasons. It's not emotional, it's not because they don't know Europe very well, it's because the fundamental structural factors of global geoeconomics have changed and made China an all-round peer competitor to the United States in a way which the Soviet Union never was. And therefore the United States, I think many commentators in the United States see Europe and indeed the Ukraine-Russia conflict through a China lens. While in Europe we see China very often through a Ukraine lens, but I think from the United States it's very different. And then on top of all that, we have a Pentagon budget which is not rising very rapidly in real terms. If you do the league table of percentage increases in defence spending across NATO since 2014. By far the biggest increases have been in the countries exposed to Russia, the Nordic countries, Poland and the Balts. The slowest percentage increases have been in the United States, the United Kingdom and France, the countries, NATO's leading powers. We've seen a big levelling up process within NATO. And for the United States, I mean, it still spends more proportionally than almost everybody else in NATO, but it hasn't been increasing. And there's so many fiscal pressures in the United States, I think it's probably pretty unlikely, even under a Republican president, that there'll be a big boost in defence spending. So they're going to have to make some really difficult choices. I would say, therefore, for Europeans, I mean, assuming NATO continues, which I think is likely the American commitment, who knows what will happen. But I think that the most plausible planning assumption for the UK right now is that America will provide a progressively smaller proportion of NATO's overall capability, and we're going to have to fill those gaps. I think that's particularly the case in relation to maritime and air capabilities, because those are the capabilities which the United States needs in the Indo-Pacific and indeed to some extent in the Middle East, while China doesn't pose a threat on land in Indo-Pacific, and therefore the US Army, if it doesn't have a Europe role, doesn't have many places to go. So I think the US Army is more likely to stick around in Europe than the rest. I'm not suggesting for a moment the US is going to withdraw, but I think American policymakers expect Europeans to take a bigger share of the burden, and we need to be prepared to fill some of the gaps which the United States might leave.
Thank you very much for that. Well, there are many challenges facing our country, and we'd now like to delve into the current and future challenges. And I'll ask Alex Baker to please lead on that particular segment of work.
So we're going to come on and talk about the equipment plan. So taking that aside, what wider economic and social developments could impact other areas of defence spending, things like personnel, infrastructure and training costs?
On the personnel side, the MOD, like much of government, was able to make significant savings in the cost of personnel by freezing military pay or increases below inflation. That took place for most of the period from 2010 onwards, as well as it happened across the rest of the public sector as well. So that made some significant savings. However, the pension costs for the armed forces have risen very rapidly. So I can't remember the exact number, but it's a very high proportionate charge which the Treasury imputes to the service personnel bill, which makes employing service people more expensive than ever, even though their pay has not been rising in real terms since 2010. Where will that all go? I don't know. I mean, partly it's a matter of policy choices, but a lot of it is to do with economy-wide trends. If the economy continues to grow at the relatively low rate of growth which the OBR assumes, 1.5% in real terms, then with limited productivity growth, then maybe real wages in the rest of the economy won't grow very much, and therefore there's less pressure on defence. But if my instinct would be that we've reached the end of the road in terms of reducing the earnings of service personnel compared with the civilian economy. So you might not restore what's been lost since 2010, but it's unrealistic to expect it to get worse without problems of recruitment and retention just getting worse. And that's particularly the case in areas where there's scarcity of skills, which we're all aware of, all the different areas where that's the case, engineering and nuclear and cyber and what have you. So there's some real cost pressures there, which have been exacerbated by the fact that the resource budget took the brunt of the cuts since the last major defence review. And then on running costs and infrastructure and so on, the MOD is still, although inflation in the period from 2020 till today was significantly higher than the Treasury assumed in the 2020 spending review, with the exception of the nuclear programme, there wasn't compensation for that, particularly in the running cost budget. And therefore, a lot of things which were projected to be affordable in 2020 aren't now. And the effect of that is felt in the defence budget incrementally. So you may have a contract which, let's say, lasts until 2026, which was written in 2021 at 2021 prices, and the companies have just had to take the risk. But when you come up to renew it, they will say, well, we're going to charge new prices. And that's going to come in, and so the delayed effect of that big inflation surge is still being felt in the defence budget. And then, of course, we have the generic UK problem we seem to have in infrastructure, which is, it's not only about personnel shortages in the armed forces, also inability to get projects delivered in time for infrastructure. And some of the big challenges in terms of military capability we have are in relation to infrastructure. We've got these massive, really complex bases, especially in the Navy, but the RAF as well, maybe less so the Army, which are really under a lot of pressure. Unless we get the infrastructure right, everything else will fall over. So that's on both the capital and the maintenance side. There's some big pressures there.
Thank you. Obviously, people, places, and kit is something that we will continually be coming back again and again. And I know that the committee is very much minded to focus in on this in future as well. But what are your thoughts in terms of just earlier this year we had under the previous committee the admission that for every 8 service personnel the MOD is losing. They've only managed to recruit 5 people in their place. And obviously we've got the issues around the estate, whether it's damp and mould, whether it's in fact the MOD itself noting, and I quote in terms of the budget, that much of its built estate is old, poor quality and expensive to run. Around 40% of the estate is actually more than 50 years old. So we've got systemic problems with regards to the issues that Alex mentioned. How can we get around this?
I mean, the only way in the end you can get around those problems is either by no longer needing that estate because you've made capability choices which mean you don't need it any longer, or investing in refurbishing that estate and making it fit for purpose. And there is, I think, interesting the messages the Chancellor sent in her budget, quite a lot of emphasis on capital spending and funding capital spending from borrowing. And one of the central purposes of capital spending in the MOD, as well as in other government departments, is absolutely to reduce running costs. It's about making what you're providing better and more fit for purpose, modern purpose, but it's also reducing running costs. And I have a very strong suspicion a lot of the areas we're talking about, if you actually had up-to-date estate, you'd need fewer people and fewer spending to maintain it, but you're maintaining. And it's the same with equipment. Actually, one of the main purposes of investing in new equipment is to allow you to retire the old costly equipment.
And it's not just in the UK where we've got issues. Some of us have been to some of our very important strategically located bases, such as Gibraltar.
Yeah.
And the previous committee had an excellent report on that particular issue in terms of defence and climate. Now, with rising sea levels, that will mean that there is huge remedial work that needs to be undertaken. Have you heard anything about what works potentially are being undertaken? Has the MOD made any statements to that effect?
I have not seen anything.
You've not seen anything
on that, no.
I just wanted to place that on record. No doubt we will come back onto this. I'd like to invite Calvin Bailey to. Alex, you wanted to come in on this particular issue before?
Yeah. So across all of these elements we've talked about, the private sector is intrinsically linked with with the MOD in terms of delivering on these areas. Sometimes it seems to me that there's a slightly adversarial relationship between the private sector and the MOD. Just wanted to ask you how much you feel like that, and is there more that could be done to sort of develop the right relationship between the department and industry to be able to make some progress on these issues? The industry, the private sector being part of the solution, seen as part of the solution, basically, to some of these issues.
I mean, part of it comes back to what I was saying earlier in terms of having a procurement strategy which has got different tiers. It's not one size does not fit all in procurement, and in those areas where essentially there is for all intents and purposes, a quasi-monopoly on the private side. You're committed to buying British. There's only one provider because that's all you can afford to fund. We can't afford to fund two competing submarine producers, so there is only one submarine producer. So it's bound to be a rather more cooperative. Of course, that doesn't mean the government's interests are exactly the same as the private provider. They're not. The private providers, by their nature, are profit maximisers, but we hope they're long-term profit maximisers rather than short-term profit maximisers, and we need to have incentives that create that. But nor does it make sense to have artificial competitive processes where you know who's going to win. And it's the bane of defence's life to have a culture of optimism bias where companies and indeed military constituencies will understate the complexity and cost of particular new capabilities in order to get it onto the programme, and then it all unravels later on as people, surprise, realise it's a lot more expensive and complex. That is something that is really important to combat. But there are then at the other end of the spectrum, I think there are capabilities which are more commodity in nature, and there is competitive procurement, and normal competitive process is perfectly legitimate. In between, it becomes more difficult. I don't think we can remove competition from the process altogether in a situation where the main providers are private, and there are lots of examples of bad practice from private providers as well as bad practice from government. So your general point is well taken, that it needs to be cooperative. What I think the government does need to do, it's almost its primary responsibility in this regard, is to set clear directions in terms of overall budgets and in terms of priorities within those budgets, accepting in some areas they can be clear about what that means for procurement. In other areas, they have to preserve a degree of flexibility.
Thank you very much. Calvin Bailey?
Yeah, sorry, a number of times during your responses you've spoken of pay increase as a pressure that is within the defence budget, and I just want to actually challenge that quite directly. The reduction that you spoke about, that was the result of the 2010 and 2015, and the management of defence over effectively the last 14 years, that doesn't manifest in a pressure. That was a risk that was accepted, that we could pay people less and we would be able to retain them. And what we actually have is that risk manifesting in the way that Tan has said, we have 8 leaving and 5 remaining. So it's not a challenge, it's not a pressure. Like, that is a relief. That is trying to address a problem that's manifested. And then to link that on, because the point of the question was about the wider economic and societal impacts upon defence. Now, noting the difference between military pay and the commercial sector, that is most obviously exposed when you have whole forces, when you have people of equivalent trade competencies side by side, and that's where we're seeing some real pressures, and that exists largely like in the whole forces, but also the PFIs. Can you kind of give us allow you to come back on those points, but I'd like to hear your view on like how that should go forward. Have we gone too far with the whole force? Should more of our personnel be in uniform so that doesn't manifest? And then secondly, the PFIs as a pressure in and of themselves. They're protected parts of the budget where there is guaranteed resource that's going to them, whilst the rest of the budget is ebbing and flowing, and mostly over the last 14 years it's been ebbing. But could you offer a view or response?
I don't think I disagree at all with the first things you said, and but all I would say is that whenever it is argued that we need to address this particular bit of a defence budget and spend more on it, then my riposte is fine. That seems very sensible. What are you going to spend less on?
It's just that we separate it from when we talk about recruitment. We say, well, we've got to pay more.
And of course,
they're the same.
Absolutely. And of course, as I indicated earlier, the pay offer is one of the reasons for the recruitment and retention problems. The state of the rest of the economy is perhaps another, availability of jobs elsewhere, and all the issues around the state of accommodation and the nature of service life, which is not always very compatible with bringing up a family and what have you. So, and then recently the issue of VAT in private schools. There's a whole range of issues which relate to those decisions as to whether to remain or not, on top of some uncertainty about what the government's priorities are in the SDR. So there's no magic bullet to solving that. I think the government will have to think about what the most cost-effective way of doing it is. Maybe the other thing, which leads you on, of course, to the Haythornthwaite review, which did attempt some costings, but very rudimentary costing, they would admit themselves. So some of the issues are relating to some of the things you alluded to in terms of changing the nature of service careers and thinking about perhaps in some cases using more or less civilians, more or less contractors for tasks which the service is doing right now. Maybe service is taking on things which others currently do. I think that, however, if you make comparisons between the services and civil equivalents, then you need to take into account the very substantial value of service pensions in that comparison. In terms of the costs of service personnel to the MOD, that massive addition, I think is around 70%, if I recall correctly, on top of the service pay, makes it more attractive to use other sort of civilian personnel or indeed contractors for tasks than if that pension contribution was less.
PFIs? PFIs.
Well, they had a value at their time, I think partly because of Treasury management. We don't have a choice, as far as I understand, just to walk away from existing contracts.
Just understand how those pressures bear out within the budget that we have as more broadly as
I don't have the numbers from that.
Thank you. Jesse Norman.
Thank you very much indeed, Chairman. Thank you, Professor Chalmers. You mentioned that, very broadly speaking, degree of seriousness in spending across Europe and indeed across NATO was very positively correlated with how close you were to Russia. So there's a degree of seriousness about the border states because they know that they've got Russia breathing down their neck with an actual threat, not shared by people further away. Can you just talk a little bit about where the UK fits into this? Because I mean, everyone thinks they're doing a very serious job in this area, and many are. In fact, probably everyone is. But the enterprise itself may not be serious in a deep way. That is to say, it may not be ready to present a threat that could be or a capability that could be used to discipline a potential adversary in all areas. So just how serious? We're not at a wartime mode, but many would argue we're in a pre-wartime scenario with Ukraine and the wider impacts that's having. How do you assess that? How do you think about that? How serious do you think the UK is on that kind of spectrum between kind of 0 to 10, where 10 is very serious and kind of war, potentially capable of fighting immediately, and 0 is not really capable of fighting immediately?
Well, in terms of budgetary allocations, first of all, on aid to Ukraine, the UK is the third largest contributor after the US and Germany in aid to Ukraine, according to Kiel Institute numbers. But our aid to Ukraine is roughly equivalent to the combined aid to Ukraine of the Scandinavian countries. And that points to the very intense concentration of effort on Ukraine in Scandinavia, which of course has got a defence budget as a whole and a GDP as a whole significantly less than the UK. So we're not giving us high priority to Ukraine in terms of aid, or in terms of changing in our own budget trajectory as the Scandinavians or the Balts or the Poles. But we're doing significantly more than many other West Europeans. So that's where we are.
Could you not argue, I didn't mean to interrupt you,
yeah.
Could you not argue that we're doing with finance a great job of supporting the Ukrainians compared to many others? But I'm really thinking about our as it were, UK domestic capability, the effective spending of money to create preparedness and capacity that can be readily and quickly deployed. That's my worry at the moment.
No, I think I wouldn't dissent with what you're saying at all. And I'd
You do understand?
No, I would accept that the UK, it's remarkable how little extra money has gone into conventional defence in the UK since 2022, compared with the very significant increases in many of our European allies. Ukraine, if you put Ukraine spending to one side, there has been really very little real terms increase in the rest of the conventional budget in the last 2 years, and that's quite unusual in NATO. I think that, if I may, Chair, just to make a linked point, that we're seeing one of the perverse consequences of the 2% target by NATO. NATO set that target in 2014. It's been remarkably successful in levelling up defence spending across the alliance. The big majority of NATO European members now meet that 2%, helped by President Putin. But those countries which were already at 2% at the beginning, including our own and the United States, have felt much less pressure. We met the norm. And then on top of that, I think the response to the full-scale invasion a couple of years ago in 2022 we haven't reacted by a big increase in our own defence budget.
Thank you very much. Just obviously we've only got 15 minutes left because the hard stop. We just want to make sure that there are 3 significant contributions yet to come. So I just want to rush things along, if I may. Michelle Scroggan, please.
Thank you, Chair. Professor Chalmers, what do you feel, or do you think it's much of a problem that we have annual spending limits on defence, given the particularly long timescales that we have for some of the major procurements? Do you see that as a significant issue?
Yeah, I do, and I think it reduces the effectiveness of defence spending. I mean, it's not unique to defence, unfortunately. It's understandable Treasury concern to look after the public finances, but the impact of it is that every year the MOD has to struggle to sometimes spend the money before it's lost, particular bits, and then also pushing back spending into April from March in order to make sure you stay within the limits. And I'm sure that's happening this year. It happens most years with the MOD that they have that problem, and that reduces. I mean, it just means you get less value for money. So it would be great if you could move beyond that, and we have moved beyond that with the nuclear budget. I think realistically, if you were to get for the Treasury to agree to move beyond annuality for most of the defence budget, they would have to have much greater assurance that the MOD was capable of managing its total budget. And there have been moments in the MOD's history where the Treasury has had greater confidence in that regard, but I wouldn't say it's the majority of the time. There's without constant high-level commitment to managing the defence budget from the Defence Secretary and the Treasury, the natural tendency in the British defence budget is for it to get out of balance, and it always takes a major review to then put it back into balance. So I think understandably the Treasury is reluctant to do that. But they have made an exception for nuclear. I don't think you have to ask Treasury officials, but my impression is that there would be circumstances in which if the MOD got its house in order in budgetary terms, then the Treasury might be prepared to consider something which would be very positive if it did.
What changes do you think could help, and are they politically realistic?
Well, I think giving essentially freedoms to the defence budget as a whole, or the equipment budget as a whole, comparable to those that the nuclear budget has. So you are able to, within an overall multi-year budget, have much more flexibility to move funds between one year and another, either move it back so you don't lose it if you can't spend it, but you can also spend it now rather than next year. Basically, an ability to move money between different financial years rather than having a fixed allocation for a particular year, that would add significantly to the cost effectiveness of defence spending.
Derek Twigg.
Okay, thanks, Chair. In the past, Parliament's been able to monitor spending on the capability programmes via the equipment plan. And there's some uncertainty about whether there'll be an equipment plan this year, because there's an issue being looked at for fit for purpose and so on. So what's your view on that? How serious is that in terms of concern?
I think it's a shame that the level of transparency has been reduced and there isn't that major equipment programme report being produced now. And I hope that we'll find a way to restore that. I think MOD officials giving evidence to this committee in the past, as I recall, did say that they didn't think this was necessarily the best system to use, and we should think maybe the committee and the MOD together should examine ways of, and indeed the Public Accounts Committee should examine ways of being more transparent with Parliament in this regard. I think I draw
So just to make clear, I'm sure you were suggesting that actually the MOD were concerned they weren't being as transparent to this committee. Is that you weren't?
I think the MOD evidence they recognise there is an issue here in relation to transparency.
They were trying to be more transparent, you think?
I think you'll have to ask the MOD what their view is. But I think they gave evidence, as I recall, a previous Defence Committee where they recognised that there was a problem in this regard.
Yes, they did too, yeah.
And which I think there is. I think one of the issues for me is about timeliness. So the more in which, and it affects outsiders such as myself as well, commenting on this, the more in which the data being provided to you is from some time ago and you comment on it, and then the MOD's response is, well, that was 18 months ago. This is what the situation is now, and it's different. It's less helpful, isn't it?
That's why we got you here, given your obviously vast experience and knowledge. How can the MOD make it more transparent for this committee?
I think most of all they can produce more up-to-date numbers, provide more up-to-date numbers. I don't think that the level of detail in the equipment plan was quite significant. Maybe at the margins you could improve it, but it's most of all the figures could be more up to date, and I think that could be done without revealing material which was either commercial in confidence or sensitive for national security reasons, I think that's possible.
Thank you very much. I think Mike Martin wanted to come in as well as Jesse Norman. So Mike first, please.
Very quickly on this transparency thing, I think it's not just equipment budget, in readiness as well. 10 years ago, this committee, Parliament, would have readiness figures, which is exactly what US Congress gets, and other nations in a similar position. So if as a whole we take this assertion that the MOD has become less transparent towards Parliament, why has that happened?
I don't know why it's happened, but I think you're absolutely right. We shouldn't only focus on the equipment budget. It should be the whole budget that should be scrutinised.
Why do you think it's happened? You were hypothesising.
No, I think that's two-party political question for me.
Fair enough. I completely take that. But don't worry, Mike. We will be delving into these issues at future meetings. I'd like to ask Jesse first and then Calvin.
Thank you. Just to pick up your point about the relatively underspend or the slowdown on spending on conventional forces, a couple of recent things. Recent report that the head of the French Navy had said to the National Assembly that there was a problem because Britain could only put out 2 of its 4 destroyers and 3 of its 9 frigates because of shortage of personnel, equipment, etc. So I think that's quite a telling. Obviously, issues of munitions issues we know about. Flag. So the question then is: do you think that the worry about optimism bias that you've diagnosed quite pervasively also applies to some of the ways in which these are being presented externally? We've been talking about 4 Brigade deploying, rapidly to the eastern flank of Estonia, but of course it's not going to have any Challenger 3s for a good long time. It's not going to have Boxer for it just feels to me that there's a degree of self-deception here, and that could be quite painful, and it's not going to deceive our opponents.
No, I think that's right. I think that we, with a budget which in relative terms is much less unique than it was. I mean, I published something earlier this year which made the calculation that in the year 2000, at the turn of a century, just before 9/11, our GDP was the same as that of China, and we had the second largest defence budget in the world. Today, we are on track within 1 or 2 years to have the 8th largest defence budget in the world. And in NATO Europe, we are much less leading than we were, and sometimes we still think we are. In reality, we're still probably the most powerful in some domains, but in other domains we're absolutely not the most powerful compared with our NATO European allies. Now, the political choice is if you want to restore that position, that relative position, across the board, then you're going to have to spend a lot more than 2.5%. If you're not prepared to do that and you're sticking to 2.5, then I do think you have to make some serious choices. If you don't make choices, then you will end up having a force which, in the IISS military balance, might look impressive in terms of number of warships and regiments and so on, but the reality behind it is much less so.
Thank you. And finally, I'd like to bring in Calvin, please.
Sorry, noting time pressures, just to go back on the point about transparency and maybe to make it slightly less malign and take it all the way back to the beginning and the Ready for War report. Perhaps the reason why Defence isn't able to articulate the gaps is that Defence doesn't actually know what it is meant to be doing on a day-to-day basis. And I know in the What is Readiness paper there was a question about ready for what. The previous Defence Secretary spoke about he could always ask, there was this thing that is operational readiness, which I don't understand and doesn't appear in any defence doctrine, because it should actually just be simply force elements at readiness. The previous Defence Secretary said if he asked Defence to do something, they would say yes, but articulate the costs. And what I'd posit is maybe the accumulation of those costs has never been resolved, and therefore the gap and the dissonance between what is being asked to do, such as the NATO ask, and what is actually being done is so great. Could I take your view on that?
I think that what our forces are being asked to do now, the primary NATO task, is to contribute to NATO deterrence of Russia in the conventional and indeed the nuclear domains, and that follows through into being ready at a particular level of notice to contribute to that. So I think that the task is pretty clear, actually.
Do you think that's true of the defence support to other government departments that routinely depletes the army of its readiness forces? All of those accumulations, Shader, where does that sit?
The MOD's mission statement talks about global military tasks.
Yeah, I think this is one of the. I think in terms of the NATO task, it's relatively at a very high level, relatively clear. But I think one of the challenges for the SDR will be coming up with their interpretation of what NATO first means in relation to a whole range of other tasks. Yes. And most of those other tasks individually don't seem that expensive or that draining, but added up, they're very considerable. And it's not only about money, it's also about time and attention. When key elements of our contribution to NATO, key force elements of our contribution to NATO, spend a significant amount of time training and involved in operations which have nothing to do with NATO deterrence of Russia and Europe, then it does erode their readiness for that primary task.
Thank you very much. Professor Chalmers, may I, on behalf of the committee, thank you for your illuminating submission today, and also I hope that everybody outside of this room has found it so, and in particular for me personally, for your cooperation over the last couple of months, your tour of your magnificent RUSI building, meeting up with all the staff and attending your various events for myself and members, I think has been very, very helpful in making us more informed within our work. I'd also like to extend my apologies to Ms. Fenella McGerty from the IISS. She was due to provide evidence. Unfortunately, due to technical difficulties, we were not able to do so. And with that, I would like to bring the first public evidence session of this newly elected Defence Committee to a close. Order, order.